Good morning and welcome to Lattes and Leaders with Dr. Brad Johnson, best-selling author and accomplished public speaker specializing in education and educational leadership. I am your co-host, Jeremy Johnson, organizational psychology consultant specializing in career coaching, training, and development. Meet us here each week to discuss topics in education and leadership and meet with some of the top education talent and thought partners from across the globe. So grab your latte, sit back, and enjoy a relaxed conversation that will leave you informed and encouraged.
So, welcome to Lattes and Leaders. I'm solo today hosting, and I am Dr. Brad Johnson. And we have an amazing guest with us today. It is Dr. Edgar Zazueta. And
You're pretty close. I was gonna let you try it, and then I'd come in. It's my little test to see how people do. No, you got pretty Zazueta, but yeah, the two Z's always,
Zazueta.
the
Oh,
Z's
okay.
always throw people off. But yeah, no, you did pretty good. I'll take it.
Zazueta. Oh, no, I like to get it right. I was like, I have a simple name because my parents knew that I would be a simple person. So, but yeah, it is a pleasure to have you today. And you're in California and you have a little different path than a lot of people we talk to. So I was just so interested in having you on and letting you share a little bit about your journey to where you are now. And then we can kind of talk about what's
Yeah.
going on now.
No, thanks, Brad. I appreciate that, and thank you for the invitation to join in this conversation. Yeah, like you said, I'm the executive director of the Association of California School Administrators here in California. So we represent about 18,000 school leaders. What's unique about our organization, maybe different than some of my counterparts around the country, is we're an umbrella organization. So we represent from superintendents to site administrators, everybody in between. I think it's our biggest strength is the fact that we're an umbrella. It's always sometimes our challenge, right? Middle management doesn't always agree with executive management and so on and so forth. But yeah, I'm humbled to be the executive director. I've been with the organization for about 9 years. Two of those, the last two as executive director. I used to run I was the senior director of policy and government relations. Hence, as you noted, my kind of non-traditional path to being the executive director of the 50 years, 51 years that we Axe has been around. I'm one of only two individuals who hasn't been a sitting or retired superintendent when I came into this role. My role had very much more been the policy space, the government relations space, thinking about how do we influence the policymakers? How do we move the needle on that front? I did spend 10 years at Los Angeles Unified School District in a variety of of capacities there, but just this journey's kind of been like mine. I intended, if you would have asked me what I was going to do, when I was a junior or a senior in high school, I would have told you I wanted to be a high school teacher, probably history or government, and I wanted to coach soccer and baseball, right? So that's kind of what I always wanted to do. So, and it's so funny because every one of my jobs has been education, married education and policy. That's what I've done my entire career from going back. I got to work in the White House. I got to work in the Department of Education. I've spent some time. Obviously, I worked in the state capitol here in Sacramento, and it was interesting because I remember right after college, right after my undergrad, I intended, okay, I'm gonna go do my credential program and then set forth on that path. I got a I got an opportunity to be a part of this prestigious fellowship in Washington D.C. And long story short, I never got back to my credential. But I think it's actually motivated me because I admire it, especially people in the classroom. I'm a family full of teachers, full of educators, and I think it's one of the reasons probably why I've continued to want to seek out other education, got my doctorate in education, and but it's made me humble to also know, especially in this role where I'm here to serve our members, that I don't always have all the answers, but I am very intentional about being a listener and a facilitator on how we can support them. So it's been an interesting journey. I'm glad that our board kind of gave me a non-traditional path, and I'm 2 years in. I think it's going pretty well. I hope they would agree. At least that's what they've told me. No, but
Right. Yeah.
I feel very fortunate to be in the role that I'm in.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I love that. We talked a little bit before, and I'm a big believer that good leadership is good leadership. It doesn't
Yep.
matter what field. And so, how being um, a little bit different path coming up and focused on policy and even I
Mhm.
guess politics, I guess to an
Yeah,
extent.
yeah. Oh,
How
yeah.
do you how do
Unfortunately, sometimes more than I want it to be politics,
right?
but it's politics.
So how do you think that kind of shaped your leadership style or vision?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think and sometimes it's easy for it to be cliche about talking about servant leadership or whatnot, but like I really do feel for me, if I we all there's this big emphasis on our why, right? Like why is it that we're doing the things that we're doing today? And for me, I think it's become pretty clear. Just to tell you a little story. So when I was first generation uh college student in my family. I'm the oldest, and my both of my parents were born in Mexico. So I had a very, when here in California, I would say it's a kind of it's a common story, right? Immigrant parents came to this country for a better life. And one of the things I always say is that early on, I realized I was always that kid who, for example, I had to translate for my parents growing up
Yeah.
because my English, even though English was my second language, and I learned English from watching Sesame Street before I went to school, and and then
So
really
did I.
some of those early lessons there. But I think what came full circle for me, like my parents were always, hardworking blue collar workers, were always nothing but supportive about education.
Mm,
They wanted me to do well. What they couldn't do for me though is like they didn't have the capacity or the wherewithal to sit over my shoulder and say, Edgar, you're doing X right. You're doing Y. This is the next step you do into college. Like a lot of, and I know this is a bit of a stereotype, but I think it's a true one. A lot of immigrant families, when they come to this country, they have an inherent trust in the system. They say that if I send Edgar to school every day, the system is gonna do right by him, right? Like, my teachers are gonna do right by him, his administrators, and for all the talk about public education, the one thing I've come to realize is that the system did do right by me. All the stuff that I said not only this job, but working back east, being in the White House, being all of these things, all this cool stuff that I got to do, it was because of the people who forged that journey for me. It was because of those leaders, those teachers, those administrators. So I like to say, and obviously we're all big proponents of public education, but for all the negative talk sometimes about what's wrong with the system, I feel like I'm an example of the system did right by me and did right by my parents, right? And I always tell our members and that's what motivates me to really go and serve those people and be a little part of that journey of our administrators here in this state who frankly I think their jobs have gotten increasingly tougher every single year, especially coming off of the pandemic. It's kind of what motivates me to do the job in that way. And also it keeps me rooted in that perspective of we have to do whatever we can to make sure we fulfill that promise to those parents, like my parents today, right? And like I see my role is just doing a little part of whatever we can do to help our members and our educational leaders uh, serve their students.
I really like that, and I've never really had someone share that perspective before. But you're so right. You know, we know in education, everybody's working hard and doing our best, but there's always that perception, especially now, you know, of all the craziness. But to think back that you know, education got you where you are, and and that that's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And along with that, but the work ethic and everything that your parents instilled within you also probably was a big part, and I know it is, and because I can share that same thing. If there's
Yeah.
one thing my parents instilled in me was work ethic. Is I think that's part of what brings out that servant leader in us because
Oh, yeah.
we know that the to get people to follow, we're willing to do whatever we ask them to do. And I
Yeah.
think that's a big part of good and effective leadership is the willingness to do that.
Yeah, I know
So
you hit
I
on
love
something
that.
that I've always believed, like, leadership at its core, and, there's different definitions of it, but it is really this focus that it's it's having people follow a path, a vision, or journey, not because they have to, because they want to, right? And I think that's almost the difference between a manager,
Yeah,
they're gonna tell you when to clock in, clock out. A leader, and somebody you see as a leader, like it's that motivation that it's not because I have to do this, it's because I want to, or I believe in that path that you're forging for myself, for an organization. So those are always the people that I know I always gravitate to in terms of people that I admire in terms of their leadership.
and you brought up another good point that I liked and really resonate with when you talked about, even in your role, and yes, you're the executive director, but you don't feel like you know it all, and you certainly, don't want to come
Yeah.
off that way. And I think that way too. I tell people all the time, I'm still learning. We all
Oh
are
yeah.
at every stage. And man, it's I just think having that kind of attitude, and again, that goes back to kind of the servant mindset,
Yeah.
is you don't want any, because we know nobody knows it all. So why would we even fake it,
No, right, right. And we always talk about a growth mindset, right? Like, and I'm a big sports fan, right? So I one of the things that I believed in, even in my career, I mean, I'm still, I guess I can't call myself a rookie anymore. Now I've been in this role now for 2 years as the executive director. But one of the things that I asked the board at that time is like, I wanted to make sure they also, in addition to my contract, hey, can you please set aside some funds to make sure that I'm getting coaching as well, right? That, like, even as I'm progressing, that I'm still making sure I have somebody to help me on my journey. And I equate that to, like, hey, if Tiger Woods or some of the best golfers, or if they have coaches, right, and when they're at the pinnacle of their careers, that's a that's a signal for us that no
Right,
matter where you're
absolutely,
at, like, there's always room for that growth.
absolutely. One of the things I share even with veterans is, look for a younger mentor. Like, be always be willing to learn, like you said, like, even the elite still have people to help them
Oh
get
yeah.
even better. And my thing is, like, if you're a veteran, you've been around, like I was 30 plus years. um so yeah, I'm probably not going to be mentored by someone that has the same experiences, and the age as me. But what I do is I look to the younger generation and I allow them to feed into me. I call it more, like a generational mentoring. But
Oh yeah.
I look to like, Gen Z, the
Yeah.
millennials, because I'm the Generation X. But I look to them to kind of help me understand motivation for their
Oh
generation,
yeah.
different things. And so that, we can always improve. And I like that you make that part of your plan. I think
Oh
that
yeah.
is so important. And I think that's good for, if veterans are listening to this, they may think, well, I've been around 30 years, but man, there's still you're still not
Oh
too
no,
old to learn and to grow.
I think that's such a great point of us even diversifying the people that we put around us. I mean, I was the young guy for a long time, and I'm still young, so I'm not gonna, but like in my all my roles, like, youngest to have this position or that position. But one of the things I'm quickly realizing, maybe it's just having kids that are now,
Hmm.
getting
Yeah.
into uh, finishing high school and whatnot. Like, now I don't feel so young anymore because they are talking about so many things that I frankly don't completely understand in terms of social media and just connectivity. So I think I actually think about this as we're thinking about one of the big challenges in Oregon. I know it's not unique to our association. It's how do you bring in those younger folks that are just starting their journey, right? Like, how do we recruit the new school principal to be a part of this organization? Because one of the things that we're realizing, and it's not unique to us, is that that people are questioning more. Like they are like this younger generation is questioning, wait, do I need to be part of this organization? Do I need to pay for this? I could go find these resources on my own. I could create my own networks. So I think one of the things that we're constantly doing is trying to get the perspectives of what's important to them and not make assumptions. What is it? What are their needs as a young school leader? What are the things that they need support on? And those are evolving. Those aren't, especially since the spring of 2020, the job of a school administrator became very different. And I would say it continues to be.
Right, absolutely, and I mean, I'm right there with you on that. I think one of the biggest things for leadership is adapting to that. Like you said, 2020, that changed a lot of things, but each generation does too. And I'm like you, I always joke and tell people, my when my nephew was about 5 years old, he probably couldn't read and write yet, or barely could, but if anybody had a problem with their computer, he could fix it.
Yeah.
That was his. That's what he grew up with. I'm like, it's funny. Like I can't get something to work, and my 5 year old nephew would come over there and fix it for me, and.
Yeah.
And I was like, that made me understand a long time ago what you were saying is that, the next generation, we got to figure out what motivates them. What do they like?
That's,
How,
yep.
how do we connect with them? Because that's the
Absolutely.
job of a good leader. It's not their job to get in line with us. It's to understand what are their needs and how do we, best equip them to be effective.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So thinking back, even with a different path, but maybe even thinking back to grade school, because you talked about, education kind of done you right.
Mhm.
Is there a teacher or two or someone along the way that really impacted you?
Oh yeah. I mean, I could think of so many of them that really I think because of this perspective of my parents really did rely on me on the system to just forge my path. And I could think of a couple. It's one of the cool stories is so obviously I represent school administrators around the state. Uh, One individual in particular, Grant Bennett, from Paris Union High School District there in Southern California. It was great because as I was going through high school, I'll fast forward first. So he ended up being a member of this organization, a superintendent. So he progressed through his career. He became a superintendent. He was actually on the board that that ultimately voted to hire me as the executive director. So it's full circle for me because he was actually my administrator when I was in high school. And I like to joke with him. He wasn't even a principal or assistant principal at the time. He was still working his way up. He was the athletic director. But it was just one of those pieces I could think about him just on all things, not only in athletics, but just he has this great story, and but it's always resonated with me. It wasn't something that I did, but it left this lasting impression that I had a friend, Efren, who's also now doing great things and involved in education, who he didn't have a ride to prom, to senior prom. And Graham Bennett, who again was our athletic director at the time, he took it upon himself to because his Efren's parents weren't able to and whatnot. He picked up him and his date and took them there. But it was just for me, it was such a small thing like that he didn't have to do. But I think for me, it was always those, and he's just an example. It's not just that he did it, but I always that always resonates with me. Like people, and now I see it firsthand because I see, especially like your school principals who have to deal with all they're supposed to be the teaching and learning experts here throughout the day, and then you would think they want to be done and go home and be with their families. Then they got to go to football games, and they got to go to basketball games, and they got to manage after school events. So they're so selfless, and I think I saw that going back to Mr. Bennett as I was young, but now I've seen it full circle where all the Grant Bennetts that I see that's a common thing of people just going above and beyond to just do whatever it takes to give our students a good experience. So that he's just one example of the countless folks who really I think, and I honestly think that's why I wanted to be a teacher. That's why I wanted to go into education. That's why I wanted to be in this path because I was I was so motivated by just what these individuals would put forth in them, right? So, like I said, my journey took a slightly different path, but I think it's the reason why every single one of my jobs has been in
Right.
education. And I think at an early age, I realized I'm going to impact the system. There's different ways to impact it, but and that's why I went the route that I did.
Yeah, that's so cool. And yeah, there are so many. One of the things I talk about is education itself. The field tends to draw people that are have a personality trait called high agreeableness, and that means they're kind,
Yeah.
empathetic, caring. And you see that so often, yeah, with teachers, even with administrators. Um, and I think it's so important, and it's going to lead me to my next question for you. But I think it's so important to help them understand the importance of self care. We always
Oh, yeah.
use that term, but it's hard for them to do it because they are always thinking about other people. They're always,
Oh, yeah.
on for, putting doing for others first. So, um, how do you do self care, and how do you, as an organization, kind of not really push it, but kind of helpfully remind them of that importance for themselves?
It's so funny you asked me that, Dr. Bride, because one of the things we've been really trying to emphasize this year is this whole notion about wellness and mental health, right? And as an association, one of the things we realize there's been a huge amount of attention on the well-being of our students. Goes without saying. I mean, I could we could go on, and I'm like deep in terms of like just my reading. I'm reading this book, The Anxious Generation. If somebody hasn't read it, really talks about how social media and just everything that our adolescents are dealing with is affecting their childhood, right? Now it goes. I know there's a lot of literature on that here these days. And as a parent of teenage daughter and a fifth grader, that this is very personal for me. So obviously, the well being of students is important. There's been a lot of attention on the burnout of teachers. The one place that, and we're biased, but we think that and the statistics show that the place where there hasn't been enough attention is the well-being of our leaders. Those people that we put in place to take care of others, have we put enough attention? And we've seen it as an organization because over the last year, and I think again, not that the pandemic created all these circumstances. I think it only exacerbated maybe some of the things that were already there, some of those challenges. But we've seen just the retention rate for some of our leaders. We've actually had some horrible instances where people they were dealing with mental health issues, and there was because of taboo or whatnot, they didn't talk about it, and
Right.
ultimately they lost that battle, right? So it's a huge emphasis for our organization in terms of wellness and whatnot. On my end, sometimes especially for our own staff, I have to think about, hey, am I practicing what I preach here? Right? Like, are we? It's
Exactly.
so easy to be in this grind culture, and I love my job, and I feel very fortunate to have it. But one of the pieces is like the balancing the travel and our families, making sure that we're taking care of ourselves physically and mentally. And I was just reading some statistics. I actually did a presentation where I was using some of these mental health statistics to our members. And it goes without saying, probably the time where we need the things that contribute to our beneficial mental health are like sleep, eating, exercise, taking some time off. Well, when you're stressed and when things are at the highest, what are the things that what are the first things to go? We don't eat well, we don't sleep, we don't exercise, we don't spend time with family. So I think it's really the fundamentals. To your question, it's there's no magic solution other than just making sure that the work is always going to be there, but are we taking those time? I'm actually teaching right now a doctoral class at Loyola Marymount University, education policy class, and we just finished our last class here for the summer session. And I still have to grade a lot of papers tonight, so that's a whole other paper. Grades are due tomorrow. But one of the things I was advising these students, because they're all overachievers, and they're students, but these are all leaders within the system. They're all current principals, or even some aspiring to be superintendent, and there's this mentality to just go, go, go. They literally finished one course, they finished their paper, and they're already asking that same day their next professor, "Hey, do you have the reading list so I could start, on the next course?" So one of the things I was advising them, and I had to follow this myself, make sure you celebrate the milestones, right? Like when you finish something, even if it's an afternoon, even if it's an hour, even it like really take that time to do some of that reflection and celebrate where you've gone before quickly transitioning to the next thing. Cause I think we all do that, right? Like we finish one thing and then we're stressed about one thing, we finish it, and instead of just giving ourselves to almost do that reset, we jump into the next piece. So I think that's really worked. The one thing in this job that I was never great at about carving out time throughout the year where we are going to be off of these screens, off of the computers. Easier said than done. But I think I've had to become more intentional. Where before it's like, oh, if I have a weekend off, I'll do this. And I knew I had to balance some of the responsibilities with my kids. But it's actually been great to just we were talking this about organization because we're very generous in terms of vacation time. Guess what we found when we look at the statistics? Nobody's taking it. Nobody is taking the vacation. So it's almost like helping people look at your calendars, carve it out, do some planning because that calendar will fill up and next thing you know, you don't have the ability to take that time to reset. So I think for me it's really just being like just like we prioritize everything else, we have to prioritize time off, downtime, quiet space to do some of this resetting.
Yeah, and I like your point that a lot of times it's just the fundamentals. It doesn't have to be something extravagant, but make sure you're getting enough sleep. Make sure you're eating properly. Make sure, you're taking that time to just get away from everything. Cuz yeah, I mean the work never
Never gonna
stops.
be
It
done.
never ends. It's never
Yeah.
and but like I said, I think it is tough and you're so right. I was in one of my books I was sharing some of those statistics and I think we always think pre March 2020, and but it was the same before. We just never paid attention to it.
Mhm.
I think as a culture, we finally realized, hey, we're burning everybody out,
Oh, yeah.
not just education, but right now. About 60% of principals say that they are depressed
Yeah.
or in full-blown depression and that's not a good place to be.
Oh,
And again it goes back to kind of that mentality, that agreeableness, that they're always thinking of others, always working,
yeah.
trying to that almost pursuit of perfection, which I try to get out of their heads. It's an impossible pursuit. And just I think once you finally get there, like you said with your kids now, like some things just make you have to stop and
Yeah.
reassess. And I think that's so important. I mean, like you said,
I'm glad you're talking about it. I'm glad we're talking about it. I think some of that taboo, I think, has been part of the challenge that people that it's okay to say when you're not okay, right? And I know that hasn't we put if you get deemed a leader, you're supposed to have all the answers. You're supposed to be the strong one. But I think that pressure of taking care of others. I mean, I've seen some of the RAND survey data that's actually one of the stressors is making
right,
sure, like principals, making sure that the well-being of their teachers is actually causing them stress themselves, right?
right.
So it's but I think that's the first step in us even just acknowledging that there's probably room here for us to have some improvement, whether it be systemically or even for us who here's the flip side. I talked about the disadvantages of having sometimes our principals and our superintendents, even to our executives, which are our superintendents, think about what are you putting on your principals? Are you asking them to do tasks that maybe they don't need to do on the accountability of reports and whatnot? So it's I think if nothing else, it sparked a really productive conversation. Hopefully, one that maybe will move to some systemic changes as we continue to look at this.
And I think we'll see this too. It kind of goes back to what you mentioned earlier about the next generation more questioning things. Because I think my generation, especially and before, we were just what you're told you do, no questions asked. And
Mhm.
again, I think in the education field, and maybe they didn't realize it, but you talked about like telling the district level, don't put too much on your principal,
Yeah.
you know. because I think they're never going to say it's too much.
Right.
Teachers aren't going to say it's too much, although they should, and that would help, but they're not going to. And so I think over time we just keep pouring in because nobody said it's too much. They just keep doing it. And
Yep.
so I think it's so important to reflect on that. And I think maybe that's why we don't see, I'm afraid the next wave of issue we're going to have is not just the attrition of teachers and principals and administrators leaving the field, but nobody coming to refill the
Nobody
place.
no, yeah. Nobody want yep. No, you're absolutely right.
And so I think we have to rethink that whole, what are their motives? They question that, I think they're just, like you said, almost has to be at least the thought of some type of systemic change, or nobody's going to want to come in the field.
Yeah. No, then we're not gonna yeah. So I think it's good that we're at least acknowledging the problem, right? And that's the first step in trying to seek some solutions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, as your journey, and I know you read a lot, it sounds like, and study and, want to grow and keep growing. Is there like a thought or nugget of wisdom or something that you would want to share with any level of school leader? I mean, maybe
Yeah.
focus on one or all, but is there something you'd really like for them to really take to heart from this?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we were having this conversation. I think the one thing that I've learned the value of collaboration, right? Like
Mm,
that the answer is usually from within. We all have gone and we've done as an organization, we're bringing outside experts and always good to have a new pair of eyes. But I think especially for our leaders, and I think this is one of the things that we realize in terms of what their supports that they need. Sometimes it's just whether we're talking about the mental health aspects or looking at academic problems of practice, that the biggest value is just people, their peers that are maybe that are going through the same thing. So it goes to one of the
mm,
bigger societal issues that we read it when we're talking about mental health post pandemic. One of the big whys is loneliness and isolation,
mm.
right? And I think that goes from
Yeah.
beyond education, but I actually think it plays itself out within our ranks as well. Hence, some of those statistics we talked about, principals, if you look at, satisfaction surveys everywhere, they've seen a drop, but actually our educators are seeing higher, but I think some of that is just feeling alone, that because they're supposed to have all the answers. So create a network, a long-winded way of saying, find your people. I was in a meeting here earlier where they're like, "Who's gonna be" if you think about it, who's your first row? Who are those people that are gonna
Mm,
show up for you, whether it be family, peers, friends? And I think just making sure that we're intentional. I think as the older we get, how often do we get together with our friends, right? Like, how do often do you
right,
call
right.
somebody up just to check up on them? And I think I struggle with this too. I've become really bad. Sometimes I get overwhelmed with like text messages and I was like, oh yeah, and then I was like, I was gonna text somebody back, but it took too long. So I think just as we invest in our career, I think investing in our personal relationships is probably the place that we can all just benefit, regardless of where we're at in our journey.
I think that's so true, especially for principals and the school level leaders. One of the things I like to say is that education, like teachers, have one of the toughest jobs, but I really think the principal has one of the loneliest jobs. And
Yep.
that was the word you hit on earlier that perked and reminded me of that because, they're struggling between the district and taking care of their staff, and they're kind of like an island, and so it's so important for them to have someone they can talk to and a mentor or even just a colleague to have that kind of rapport. In fact, it's funny, but I named this Lattes and Leaders because way back in the day when I was an administrator and mentoring people, I would purposely meet them somewhere outside of the school, which would be a Starbucks or a coffee shop
Yeah, yeah,
because it's informal, it's laid back, it's less pressure,
yeah.
and you usually get the best conversations in that
Oh
type of
yeah,
setting. And
absolutely.
and so
Yeah,
I'm just so in agreement with you on that, it doesn't matter if you've been a principal 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years. It's so important to have somebody you can just, even if it's
yeah,
just to vent to sometimes, just to
yeah,
have
yeah,
that person. And I think that helps too because like you said, when you have somebody like that, um, you don't feel like you're the only one going through it. And that
Yeah.
helps a lot with that almost loneliness, feeling like you're the only person that's going through this or experiencing this. So I think that is such an important piece of it. That is a great piece of advice. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. No, one I say it and I'm gonna follow it myself too, right? Like I need to like we sometimes need to be reminded of like practice what we preach because isolate it's so easy to just get caught up with our day to day, but it's an investment like anything, like all the other things we said we have to keep eye on. I think it's these human connections. It's become more and more apparent how those are paramount as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Man, any other thought you want to share before we wrap up? This has
Uh
been so good. I mean, you're just
No, I
good
appreciate
information.
this conversation. I appreciate the issues you're bringing up. You're putting a spotlight on it because I think whether, like you said, for our educational leaders, but frankly for just anybody that is trying to forge that path in leadership, there's no one way to do about it, right? And I think that's
Right.
the one thing that I realized. While I will always have people that I admire and I say, "Oh, I really like how they do XYZ," but I always have to remind myself, but you know what? But Edgar, you have to put your own fingerprint on it, right? Like
Right.
you have to forge your own path, and knowing that there's no wrong or right way to do it. And I think that applies for all of our folks, right? You know, regardless of what industry or what they're trying to do. So yeah, no, I appreciate the conversation and I appreciate you're bringing these issues to the forefront.
Yeah, and I like what you said there because it's so important. Your fingerprint is your strengths. Focus on your strengths, bring them. So often we focus, everybody's worried about their weaknesses or not
Yeah,
being a strength in an area of someone else, but that's not who we are.
no,
We can see, maybe we can take things, but at the end of the day, yeah, what strengths we bring are what's going to make us most successful.
absolutely,
So I
absolutely.
really like that. All right, one last question before I let you
Yeah.
go. So this is lattes and leaders. So what
Uh-huh.
is your hot beverage of choice? Is it coffee
Yeah,
latte or
here's
something else?
it's kinda boring, but it's an Americano. Like, I think that's my, and I d you know, although I've been drinking a lot more, black coffee here for whatever reason I think I think I had to reset. I don't have much of a sweet tooth, so I've never been big on, like, the real flavored drinks. But I think there's something about the simplicity, and I know it sounds bad, but there's a simplicity about a good cup of, just coffee that hasn't been that you haven't introduced all the other foreign quantities. So I don't know. Sometimes it's just the bitterness. You know what I attribute to, and I think this is the good memory. Like when you go camping and you have to just minimize. You can't take all the stuff
Yeah,
with you,
yeah,
and when you
yeah.
go camping, and there's something about just like a fresh pot of coffee there, where you can't do all the fancy stuff, but it's like it feels like it's even more rewarding in the simplicity. So I don't know, Americano,
I
black
love
cup of
that.
coffee. That's usually my go-to.
Well, I love the analogy, man. I have flashbacks to camping now, and you're so right. So that's pretty cool. Well, I tell you what, I appreciate you being on. I appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate the focus that y'all have on the leaders, and because sometimes we focus on the teachers, which we should, but man, we got to take care of those leaders so they can take care of the teachers, and I think that's so important. So I appreciate what you're doing, and man, I appreciate you just taking the time to be here
Of
today.
course, thank you, appreciate you, and then I've enjoyed the conversation. And keep up the good work here of highlighting leaders and topics that could benefit others.
Absolutely. All right. Well, you have a great day.
Thank you.
This has been Lattes and Leaders with Dr. Brad Johnson. We hope that you leave today feeling informed and inspired. For more educational content, be sure to add this podcast to your list and follow Dr. Johnson on any and all social media platforms. For more information on Dr. Johnson, Jeremy Johnson, and special guest, check out drbradjohnson.com. That is DOCTOR, bradjohnson.com. Hope to have you back soon.